The Quiet Storm. Amira's Beginning. Amira Vargas had always been the kind of woman who walked through life without needing to make noise. She wasn't the type to post gym selfies, wear flashy athletic gear, or talk about grind culture while sipping protein shakes in mason jars. In fact, most people wouldn't even know she trained at all. If you passed her on the street, you'd probably assume she was heading to a library or a farmer's market, not preparing to enter a world of takedowns and triangle chokes. She was 33 years old, lived in a modest apartment above a bakery in a quiet town just outside San Antonio, Texas, and worked at the local library. She liked cats, she loved banana bread, and she really hated confrontation, which made it strange, at least to the outside observer, that she had recently signed up for Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes. "I just wanted to feel stronger," she had told her reflection one evening, brushing her curly brown hair back and tying it up into a loose bun. "Not for anyone else, just for me. But the mats weren't built for the quiet ones. Her first day at Iron Circle BJJ was rough. The gym was an echo chamber of sweaty testosterone and competitive banter. The blue mat smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the room was filled with the sound of slapping leather, heavy breathing, and the occasional triumphant shout of, "Tap!" Amira stepped onto the mats in a plain black GI she'd bought online for $40, her white belt wrapped twice around her waist and tied in a knot that was already coming undone. She stood there awkwardly, watching the other students roll, white belts clumsily flailing, blue belts moving with practiced fluidity, and black belts gliding like ghosts through limbs. "Hey," someone said behind her, startling her out of her anxious trance. She turned to see a tall, heavily muscled man with an unmistakably smug grin. His GI was emblazoned with patches, sponsors probably, and he wore a black belt as if it were a royal sash. "You knew?" "Yes," she said, voice calm but quiet. He didn't respond immediately, just gave her a quick up and down, taking in her modest appearance like a critic judging a painting he'd already decided not to like. "Well, don't worry," he said with a condescending chuckle. "We'll go easy on you, library lady." That's how the nickname started, library lady. At first it seemed harmless, a little teasing, something to chuckle about during warm-ups. But then came the whispered jokes when she failed to complete a sweep, the mocking claps when she tapped, out early during drills, the smirks from the sideline whenever she got caught in a choke she didn't see coming. Week after week, Amira kept showing up. She listened, she drilled, she tapped a lot. She cried in her car after more than a few sessions, but never once considered quitting. "I'm not here for them," she reminded herself over and over. "I'm here for me." Still, it stung. She'd never been the most athletic person. In high school, gym class was a battlefield and she was always the last one picked. But jiu-jitsu wasn't supposed to be about brute strength. It was the gentle art, right? Technique over power, leverage over size. Yet somehow, library lady had become the inside joke of the Iron Circle. It didn't help that the gym had an unofficial pecking order. Black belts at the top, then brown, then blue, and so on. At the bottom were the white belts, of course, and somewhere beneath that sat Amira, like a floor mat for the floor mats. But one thing they didn't know was that Amira had been studying, not just on the mats, at home too, when she wasn't shelving books at work. She was watching endless hours of instructional videos, analyzing match footage and reading breakdowns of technique on forums and blogs. She even took notes, handwritten, detailed notes with diagrams and flowcharts. If there were a degree in jiu-jitsu theory, Amira would have been on the honor roll. Her mind was a library, and she had finally found a subject that lit her up. The turning point came 6 months into her training. It was a chilly Wednesday evening in February, the kind of night where the mats were cold to the touch and steam rose off the bodies rolling in the gym. Coach Diego, a grizzled black belt with cauliflower ears and a heart of gold, had been watching Amira for a while. "Let's mix it up," he said, clapping his hands. "Live rounds. Pick someone who challenges you." Amira scanned the room. Most of the students already had partners. Then her eyes landed on Tony, the very same black belt who had dubbed her library lady. He was talking loudly to one of the blue belts, laughing about some tournament he'd recently crushed. Without thinking, Amira walked up to him and said, "Want a roll?" Tony looked at her, stunned. Then he laughed. "Oh, you want to go live, library lady?" he said, standing up and cracking his neck. "All right, let's dance." They moved to the center of the mat. Others began to notice. A few stopped their own rolls to watch. After all, this was going to be a slaughter, right? The timer beeped. They slapped hands, bumped fists. Then, chaos. Amira didn't hesitate. She closed the distance and shot for a deep collar grip, using her right hand to break posture and her left to underhook his sleeve. She had drilled this exact setup 1,000 times. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't pretty, but it was precise. Tony went to pass her guard and left his left arm extended just a fraction too long. She didn't miss it. With the speed of someone who had rehearsed this in her sleep, Amira spun under, locked her legs up, omoplata threat, and Tony instinctively postured up to escape. She used his movement against him, flowing into a triangle choke, her legs clamping tight. His eyes widened. He fought it. He tried to stack her, tried to posture. But Amira adjusted, pulling his head down, her calves digging in like steel cables. 14 seconds later, tap, 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 silence. Dead. Pin drop. Silence. Tony sat up, gasping, his face flushed with disbelief. He looked at her like she was a ghost, a glitch in the matrix, a quiet storm that had suddenly erupted. The room exploded, not in laughter this time, in disbelief, in awe, and slowly, begrudgingly perhaps, with respect. Coach Diego walked over, nodded once and said, "Beautiful setup." No one called her library lady after that. They called her the Quiet Storm. And Amira? She didn't gloat. She didn't post a victory reel on Instagram. She just smiled, bowed respectfully, and walked back to the edge of the mat. Because she knew. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. The fire within. Amira's unseen battle. The night after submitting a black belt in 14 seconds should have felt like victory, like fireworks and champagne, or at the very least a quiet sense of triumph. But for Amira, it felt like her world had shifted, subtly, but undeniably. That night, back in her small apartment above the bakery, she didn't feel like a champion. She sat on the edge of her bed, her GI still damp from sweat and adrenaline, her muscles humming with residual tension, and all she could do was stare at her hands. They trembled. Not from fear, but from a kind of internal storm she hadn't yet learned to name. It was the kind of moment where the soul knocks on its own door and asks, "What now?" She hadn't meant to make a statement. She hadn't set out to make anyone look bad or to draw attention. But the moment had happened. 14 seconds of perfect alignment, perfect timing, and perfect execution. And now she was no longer invisible. People saw her, not just as a quiet woman in a black guy, not just as the library lady, but as something else. Something unexpected. Something that made others whisper. The next morning, the whispers followed her into the bakery below. The shop owner, Mrs. Juarez, who knew her only as the quiet girl who ordered the same cinnamon bun every Thursday, slid her coffee across the counter with a raised brow. "Mijija, someone showed me a video on Instagram. That was you, right? In the pajamas, choking that big guy?" Amira blinked. "It's a GI. "A what?" "The pajama thing, it's called a gi. Well, whatever it is, you made that man look like a scarecrow caught in a washing machine. Dios mio." She left the bakery with a blush on her cheeks and more questions swirling in her mind. She hadn't even known the role had been recorded. Somewhere in the background of the class, someone must have filmed it and posted it online. That explained the texts from unknown numbers, the sudden new followers on her dormant social media account, the fact that people she hadn't spoken to since high school were suddenly sending her messages with phrases like, "Whoa, didn't know you were a badass now." But none of that changed the fact that her win had put a spotlight on her that she had never asked for. Tony, the black belt she had submitted, had left the gym abruptly that night and hadn't returned for 3 classes. Some said he was just taking time to rest an injury. Others hinted at bruised pride. Either way, Amira didn't feel like she'd won a war, only that she had accidentally started one. Still, the fire inside her had been lit, and it wasn't about validation or revenge or proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving herself right. That she belonged. That even the quietest soul could carry a flame so intense it didn't need to roar to burn. She had tasted clarity for the first time. Those brief 14 seconds when body and mind became one and everything she'd studied, drilled, and believed in had flowed out of her with grace. Her training shifted, not in intensity, she'd always worked hard, but in focus. She no longer second-guessed her instincts. She no longer hesitated. When trying a new technique, no longer feared failing in front of others. If she failed forward. She watched videos late into the night, scribbling in her notebook until the pages were a collage of arrows, annotations, and corrections. She trained on Sundays when the gym was nearly empty, working her guard recovery drills alone, over and over until they became muscle memory, Coach Diego noticed. He didn't say much, he wasn't the type to shower praise. But one evening, during open mat, he sat beside her and simply said, "You see it now?" Amira looked at him confused. "See what?" "The gap," he replied. "The space between the art and the ego. Most people never see it. They just wrestle themselves every day, chasing medals and likes. But you saw it. That's why. You're dangerous now, that's why you're real." She didn't know what to say to that. She only nodded, the weight of the compliment sinking into her like ink on paper. Dangerous. Real. Words she never imagined would be associated with her. But life, as it often does, has a funny way of humbling you when you think you're finally on solid ground. 3 weeks later, Coach Diego announced a local in-house tournament at Iron Circle, a small event meant for white and blue belts to test their progress in a controlled, friendly environment. A stepping stone. "You're competing," he told her flatly, before she could even protest. Amira blinked. "I've never competed before." "You submitted a black belt. You're ready." "I only trained for self-growth." "That's cute, but now you train for truth." She couldn't argue with that. The truth had always been her compass. The weeks leading up to the tournament were brutal. Not because of the techniques. Amira had trained herself into a quiet machine, but because of the mental battle, the internal dialogue, the self-doubt. That same old voice, dusty and familiar, whispering in her head, "What if you lose? What if it was just a fluke? What if everyone was right all along?" But there was another voice now, too. Newer. Fiercer. What if you win? What if you were never the joke? What if this is who you were meant to be all along? She held on to that voice like a lifeline. The night before the tournament, she sat in her room with her notebook open. She didn't study moves. She didn't game plan strategies. She simply flipped to the first page she had written 6 months ago. The words were shaky, the handwriting awkward, but the message was clear. "I don't want to be fearless. I want to be brave." That was still true. The morning of the tournament arrived with gray skies and a slow drizzle. The mats had been cleaned until they sparkled. The chairs arranged for spectators, and the gym buzzed with a different kind of energy. Half excitement, half anxiety. Competitors shuffled nervously, adjusting their belts, bouncing on their heels, trying to act like it didn't matter when, deep down, they knew it did. Amira walked in with her hoodie up and her mouth set in a line. She didn't look like a fighter. She looked like a librarian out for a morning walk. But her eyes told a different story. She was placed in the women's white belt lightweight division. 3 matches. Single elimination. If she lost, once it was over. Her first match was against a young, wiry woman with sharp elbows and a glare like flint. The ref shouted, "Combat," and they clashed. Amira took a few seconds to gauge her opponent's rhythm. She felt the tension in the grips, the speed of transitions, and then, like water slipping through fingers, she flowed. Guard pull, collar sleeve, balloon sweep, mount, cross-collar choke. Victory in just under a minute. Her second opponent was tougher. A compact powerhouse with judo experience. They scrapped hard. Amira was thrown, scrambled, recovered guard, and then reversed position with a pendulum sweep that made Coach Diego nod from the sidelines. They rolled for nearly 5 minutes, before Amira locked in an armbar and gently but firmly forced the tap. The finals were different. The girl across from her was all eyes and angles, fast, fluid, a true test. Their match went the full round, sweeps, escapes, points, trading back and forth like a pendulum. Amira found herself down by 1 point in the final 30 seconds, pinned, inside control. The crowd was cheering, coaches yelling, the gym echoing with the thunder of claps and foot stomps. But inside her, absolute silence. Focus. Fire. She bridged. She shrimped. She re-guarded with precision. Her opponent tried to stall. 10 seconds. Amira sat up into a technical stand. 5 seconds. She shot forward, pulled guard, and transitioned mid-air into a triangle choke. Time. The ref raised her hand. Submission win. Division champion. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked to the heavens, whispered a quiet thank you, and then turned to her coach. "I'm ready," she said. Coach Diego smiled. "For what?" She exhaled slowly. "For everything." Rise of the storm. Amira steps beyond the circle. In the weeks following the in-house tournament, the Iron Circle gym transformed in subtle but undeniable ways. What had once been a background hum of skepticism toward Amira now carried a different energy. 1 part curiosity, 1 part admiration, and a dash of something else that hadn't existed before. Respect. Not the kind given automatically because someone wore a certain color belt or because they barked louder than others. This was the quiet, earned kind. The kind that simmered in the air and didn't need to be declared. Amira, for her part, didn't change. At least not in the ways people expected her to. She still came in early, left late, swept the mats with the same quiet care, and took notes in her dog-eared notebook that now looked like it had survived a hurricane. But inside, she was changing in ways that even she couldn't quite articulate. Yet. Something was unfolding. Something was waking up. She began training with more intention, not harder necessarily because she had always pushed herself, but smarter. She started drilling with people who challenged her instead of those who gave her easy rounds. She rolled with the awkward white belts, the hungry blue belts, and the relaxed but deadly brown belts. Her ego stayed tucked behind the belt knot, at her waist where it belonged. Each loss was simply data. Each tap she gave away was a lesson in disguise. She approached the mat the same way she'd approached literature back in her library days, with reverence, analysis, and a thirst to understand. Then one day, Coach Diego pulled her aside. "There's an invitational happening in 4 weeks," he said, his voice neutral, his gaze steady. "It's no guy advanced rule set. You'd be going up against blue belts and up. Might even face some purples, not point-based. All submission only. I think you should enter." Amira blinked. "You think I'm ready for that?" "I know you're not." The statement hit her like a slap wrapped in wisdom. "But," he continued, "you're ready to get ready, and that's the difference." She thought about it for a long time. The idea of stepping into a bigger spotlight was both electrifying and terrifying. But eventually she signed up, not because she believed she could win, but because she believed she could grow. And that belief, as she had come to understand, was the kind that mattered most. The lead-up to the invitational was unlike anything she had ever prepared for. No-gi was a different beast entirely. The lack of grips, the slickness of sweat, the need for faster transitions, the wrestling-heavy scrambles. It was as though she had entered a whole new language of combat. She threw herself into it completely, studied the leg lock entries, practiced heel-hook defenses, drilled guillotine escapes until her neck felt like a bendy straw. But the biggest shift was not physical, it was psychological. Coach Diego began taking her through visualization drills. Before every training session, she would sit cross-legged on the mat, eyes closed, and he would talk her through imagined scenarios. Feel your heartbeat as you step onto the mat. Smell the sweat in the air. Hear the crowd, the announcer. Picture your opponent. Picture losing position. Picture staying calm. Picture reversing it. Picture finishing. These mental sessions, though foreign to her at first, became a sanctuary. A rehearsal not for perfection, but for adaptability. Because that was the nature of jiu-jitsu. Not domination, but adaptability. The gentle art, after all, was not about force. It was about flow. 4 weeks passed in a blur of soreness, study, and sleepless nights. And then, the day came. The Invitational was held in a high school gymnasium transformed into a battlefield. Bright lights, folding chairs, banners hung high with logos of sponsors that sounded like they sold energy drinks and rash guards. Amira arrived with her gym bag slung over one shoulder and a borrowed pair of competition shorts that still smelled faintly of menthol rub. Her heart was beating in her ears, but her eyes were calm. Her bracket was a Shark Tank. Blue belts from big name schools, aggressive athletes with years of competition behind them. A few of them had already gone viral for flashy finishes and highlight reels. Amira, by comparison, was still relatively unknown, except for one short clip of her submitting Tony, which had circulated quietly among local grappling circles. Her first opponent was a blue belt from a school that prided itself on leg locks. He was taller, lankier, and opened the match like a whirlwind, immediately pulling guard and hunting for a heel hook. But Amira had been ready for this. She disengaged, passed with precision, and controlled him with such quiet composure that by the 3-minute mark he was visibly frustrated. She ended the match with a back take and a rear naked choke so clean it looked choreographed. Submission, victory, but it was her second match that changed everything. Her opponent this time was no mere blue belt. She was a rising star, Dana "Dagger" Morales, an experienced purple belt known for her aggressive pace and ruthless top pressure. She was fast, brutal, and unrelenting. Most people assumed Amira wouldn't survive the first 2 minutes. Even Coach Diego had pulled her aside before the match and said only, "Stay true to your rhythm. Let her get tired trying to break it." The match was an inferno. Dana opened with a snap-down that nearly buckled Amira's knees, then pounced, with a guillotine attempt that turned into a Kimura trap. Amira survived by millimeters, escaping like smoke through cracks in a wall. Every time Dana thought she had locked her down, Amira slipped through, not with brute strength but with angles, timing, and unshakable calm. 6 minutes in, Dana made her first mistake. She overcommitted to a pass and left her leg exposed. Just a second too long, Amira didn't hesitate. She trapped the leg, transitioned to 50-50, and began isolating the heel. The crowd leaned forward. Dana twisted, pulled, but Amira locked the position like a machine. No wasted motion, no panic. She cranked. Tap. The gym erupted. The upset was seismic. People who had barely noticed her before were suddenly scrambling to know her name, where she trained, what her story was. Interview requests, sponsorship offers, even an invitation to train at a high-profile gym out of Austin, all came within 48 hours. But Amira wasn't interested in attention. She was interested in ascension. Back at Iron Circle, Coach Diego handed her a new belt one evening without ceremony. It was blue, deep navy, the kind of blue that spoke of deep waters and uncharted depths. She didn't cry, didn't cheer, just tied it around her waist and bowed deeply. The entire gym clapped, not because it was tradition, but because they had watched her earn every single fiber of it. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, drinking herbal tea and icing her knees, Amira stared out the window at the city, lights below. She wasn't just changing anymore, she was evolving, not into someone new, but into who she had always been, beneath the layers of doubt and silence. A storm, yes, but not the kind that destroys, the kind that transforms. The weight of the name, Amira's quiet reckoning. The blue belt tied around Amira's waist didn't feel like a prize. It felt like armor, heavy, resilient, and not entirely comfortable. It was the color of deeper water, a colder ocean, a place where the currents weren't just unpredictable, they were unforgiving. And in the days that followed her stunning upset at the Invitational, Amira began to realize that the deeper you go, the darker it gets. Respect may have come quickly, but with it came something she hadn't trained for: attention. She felt it first in the gym. Not in the congratulations, those had been warm and sincere, but in the way people now hesitated before rolling with her. Some of the white belts gave her too much space, as if afraid to offend. Others went too hard, trying to make a name for themselves by tapping the viral blue belt. The camaraderie that had once existed in whispers and shared frustrations now carried undertones of competition. Her training became a negotiation between egos, hers and everyone else's. Then there were the messages. Dozens a day. Strangers wanting to roll sometime, instructors inviting her to guest train, influencers asking her to collaborate. Some wanted interviews, others offered gear in exchange for promotional photos, and one even suggested she should start a lifestyle brand for quiet killers. Amira didn't even know what that meant. She had joined jiu-jitsu to find her strength, not to become a brand. But now there was pressure to package herself into a version of success the world could understand and profit from. She tried to ignore it, tried to keep her focus rooted in the mats and the details of technique and the discipline of routine. But it wasn't long before the storm began to creep into her personal life. People at the library had found the video clips. Her co-workers joked about her secret life as a ninja, and the library director, though supportive, asked if her outside activities might affect her focus at work. Friends from her old life messaged her with questions that felt more like projections. Don't you think all this fighting stuff is a bit much? Aren't you worried about getting hurt? When did you become so intense? Amira didn't know how to answer them. She hadn't become something else. She had simply stopped hiding who she was. But there was no way to explain that to people who had only known her as gentle, soft-spoken, non-confrontational Amira, the one who organized poetry nights and never interrupted. They hadn't seen the version of her that studied submissions like sonnets or who found serenity in the chaos of combat. They hadn't understood that the mat wasn't violence, it was clarity. And still, the world kept turning. With her rise came challenges she couldn't have anticipated. She entered more competitions, winning some, losing others. The wins were praised, the losses dissected. People who had never spoken to her now felt entitled to critique her footwork, her pacing, her composure. Online comments began to appear, under her match videos, most encouraging, some toxic. One particularly bitter commenter called her a fluke artist with a triangle and nothing else. That one stuck with her longer than she wanted to admit. Coach Diego noticed the shift. He always did. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session where Amira had struggled against a tenacious wrestler who outpaced her in scrambles, he pulled her aside. "You're gripping too tight," he said. Amira looked at her hands, confused. "I'm not even going for grip-heavy stuff today." "Not your hands. Your mind. You're gripping the idea of what you think you should be. Let go of that." She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just tired." He didn't push, just nodded. "Then rest. Burnout looks a lot like failure until you recover." But resting was harder than it sounded. She'd built her life around discipline, structure, training. If she stopped now, she worried the storm might dissipate, that she'd lose the edge, the focus, the fire. So she pushed on, ignoring the aching joints, the mounting pressure, the creeping self-doubt. She started training twice a day, supplementing with strength sessions in the mornings, reviewing tape at night. Her body responded at first, stronger, sharper, but eventually, the cracks began to show. It started small, a missed transition, a foggy reaction in a scramble, then a tightness in her rib cage that wouldn't quite go away. She brushed it off, chalking it up to fatigue. But during a particularly intense sparring session, she twisted the wrong way during a guard recovery, and pain lit up her side like fireworks. She tried to keep going, biting back a scream, until she collapsed, clutching her ribs. The diagnosis: a muscle tear and hairline fracture, 6 weeks minimum off the mats. It felt like a death sentence. For the first few days, she paced her apartment like a caged animal. She tried to stay involved, watched her teammates train, gave advice from the sidelines, but it wasn't the same. She wasn't in it, and every day she wasn't rolling felt like erosion. Her notebook remained untouched on the coffee table. Her gi hung limp on the hook by the door. And yet, in the stillness, something began to settle. She returned to the library full-time during her recovery. Not because she had to, but because she missed it. The quiet, the rhythm, the order of books waiting to be shelved. One afternoon, she found herself pulling a volume of poetry from the return cart, Pablo Neruda. She hadn't read poetry in months. She sat at a table by the window, opened the book, and let herself exhale. The words fell over her like water. You can cut all the flowers, but you cannot keep spring from coming. That night, she returned home and opened her notebook again. She didn't write technique. She wrote poetry, about struggle, about silence, about resilience and solitude and fire that doesn't scream. It glows. Slowly, Amira began to heal. Not just her body, but her sense of identity. She realized she didn't have to choose between being the quiet librarian and the fierce competitor. She was both. She was all of it. And if the world had trouble understanding that, well, that was the world's problem. When she finally returned to the mats, she moved slower, more mindfully. She didn't rush to reclaim her former pace. Instead, she focused on flow, on intention. And though she hadn't rolled in 6 weeks, her timing hadn't vanished. In fact, she found herself reacting cleaner, thinking clearer. Her first hard roll back was with one of the newer blue belts, a young woman who had looked up to her since day one. After a back-and-forth exchange, Amira caught her in a transition, flowed into mount, and secured a cross-collar choke. The woman tapped, sat up, and smiled through her breathlessness. "You're different," she said. "Like, more dangerous." "But calmer," Amira grinned, tying her belt again. "That's because I stopped trying to prove anything." She looked across the mats at the new faces coming in, the old faces still grinding, the lineage of warriors building themselves day after day. And she felt it, deeper than pride, louder than victory. A grounded sense of purpose. Not to win, not to rise, but to become. Storm of expectations. Amira and the weight of I's success was not the mountaintop Amira had imagined as a white belt. It wasn't a banner moment or a standing ovation or a neatly tied bow at the end of a triumphant journey. Success, as it turned out, was heavier than failure. It came with eyes, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, watching, measuring, comparing. Some eyes were supportive, full of admiration and hope. Others were critical, scanning for cracks, inconsistencies, any small detail they could spin into proof that she didn't deserve her place among the ranks. But the heaviest eyes of all were the ones she carried within herself. After returning from her rib injury and re-establishing her presence at Iron Circle, Amira's reputation had outgrown the gym. She wasn't just the quiet storm anymore. She was the up-and-comer, the dark horse, the underdog turned contender, a quiet but steadily rising name on local forums, whispered about in tournament warm-up rooms and occasionally listed as a dangerous wild card in brackets where bigger names still ruled the headlines. Her upset victory over Dana Morales had become something of a myth. The librarian who triangled the purple belt, they called it, as if it were a fairy tale. But Amira didn't feel like a myth. She felt like a woman still trying to hold her life together with modesty, training tape, and a lot of tea. Her next test came in the form of an invite to a regional championship, a major event that pulled in talent from multiple states, including seasoned competitors from high-profile schools in California, Arizona, and Colorado. The submission-only format and advanced rule set made it clear this was not a white belt-friendly affair. These were wolves in human skin, and stepping into that cage meant one thing. Amira would need to bring more than just her technique. She would need to bring her truth. She accepted the invitation with a sense of calm that surprised her. There was no celebratory post, no countdown on social media. She told only Coach Diego and a few close friends. The rest could find out when they saw the brackets. For Amira, this wasn't about the spotlight. It was about walking into the storm and standing still. Preparation for the event was unlike anything she'd experienced. This time, it wasn't just about skill. It was about pressure. Every time she trained, she felt the weight of expectation pressing against her spine. Her gym was proud of her, but also watchful. They were rooting for her, but they were also measuring her. What if she lost in the first round? What if the videos went viral again, but this time for the wrong reasons? What if she was just a flash in the pan? She trained through it all. Harder, smarter, more quietly. She dialed in her guard retention, sharpened her front headlock series, and drilled leg entanglements until she could find them in the dark. But she also took walks again, read more poetry, cooked for herself, played jazz while icing her knees. She understood now, more than ever, that the fight didn't begin when the ref said go. It began the moment you allowed yourself to believe that your worth could be determined by one match. The day of the championship came wrapped in cold morning fog. The event was held in a converted convention center, where the mats stretched across the floor like islands in a sea of chaos. Coaches barked instructions, competitors shadowed their movements in warm-up areas, and vendors sold everything from pre-workout shots to rash guards covered in skulls and fire. Amira moved through it all with quiet detachment, her eyes scanning, but never lingering. She didn't wear headphones or sit in a corner wrapped in a hoodie like others did. She stood barefoot near mat 3, stretching her shoulders slowly like a dancer preparing for a stage that had nothing to do with applause. Her bracket was stacked, 5 matches to gold. Her first opponent was from a renowned West Coast gym, a blue belt who had trained since childhood and had a highlight reel of explosive takedowns and dynamic backtakes. The match began with that same explosiveness, but Amira had learned to weather storms. She tied her opponent up in a modified D. La Riva Guard controlled the pace and waited. When the moment came, she inverted with a smooth transition and locked in a triangle from the bottom. It wasn't flashy. It was surgical. Tap. Her second match was more grueling. 10 minutes of back-and-forth exchanges, constant scrambles, and grip fighting that left her forearms burning. She won on the edge of fatigue, slipping into a guillotine off a failed takedown attempt, her breath coming in ragged but controlled bursts. 2 down. 3 to go. In the quarterfinals, she faced a competitor with a significant experience advantage, a purple belt with 3 regional titles and a brutal reputation for pressure passing. For the first 6 minutes, Amira spent most of the match flattened under side control, surviving an onslaught of shoulder pressure and near submissions. But something inside her refused to panic. She didn't need to escape in style. She just needed to survive long enough to find an opening. And she did. With less than a minute remaining, she framed, created a pocket of space, and slid her knee through. From there, the rest was a flowchart. Reverse pass mount arm triangle victory. The crowd began to notice now. People who had been focused on other mats turned their attention toward the woman in the plain black rash guard with no sponsors, no entourage, and no nonsense. She wasn't the loudest, she wasn't the flashiest, but she was winning. Quietly, methodically, unshakably. The semifinals brought pain, not metaphorical pain, real, blinding, physical pain. A knee slice attempt that went wrong, a bad angle, and a loud pop. Amira felt it instantly. Her inner knee screamed in protest, but adrenaline, that cruel and beautiful drug, carried her through. She won that match with a toe hold, her own leg, shaking beneath her as she limped off the mat. "You can pull out," Coach Diego said quietly backstage. "You've already proven more than enough." Amira looked at him, sweat running down her face, pain pulsing in waves from her knee. And yet her voice was calm. "If I tap in the finals, I tap, but I need to walk out there." Coach Diego said nothing, only put his hand on her shoulder for a moment longer than usual. The finals felt surreal. Bright lights overhead, cameras filming, an announcer mispronouncing her last name. Her opponent was the favorite to win, a top-ranked purple belt with aggressive wrestling and a reputation for never needing more than 3 minutes to finish a match. The woman across from her looked like a champion. Amira looked like someone who'd been through a war. The match began. Amira pulled guard, her injured leg protected by framing and cautious movement. She slowed the pace, turned the aggression into hesitation. It was a dance, and Amira dictated the rhythm. Her opponent grew frustrated, overcommitted to a leg pass, and gave Amira the angle. Triangle. Again. It didn't finish. She transitioned. Armbar. Not deep. Enough. Regard. Reset. 14 minutes in. The crowd held its breath. 15 minutes. Her opponent shot forward. Amira caught the neck, rolled, adjusted. Guillotine, tight, tap, silence, then eruption. Amira didn't scream, didn't flex, didn't cry. She knelt on the mat, chest heaving, her hands resting on her thighs. And in that moment, with the referee raising her arm and her knee still screaming, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt something deeper. Stillness. Not the stillness of absence. The stillness of arrival. She had stepped into the storm and become the eye of it. The legacy within, Amira's second belt. When the adrenaline faded and the spotlight dimmed, what remained wasn't gold or applause, or even the weight of another medal added to a box under Amira's bed. What remained was something quieter, deeper. A stillness she hadn't felt since her first day on the mat. Except this time it wasn't the stillness of uncertainty or fear. It was peace. That calm that comes only after the storm has passed, and you've discovered that you were the eye of it all along. Her victory at the regional championship had made her a name. Sponsors now offered actual contracts. Her matches were analyzed in detail by YouTubers and breakdown channels. Her social media following had ballooned overnight, even though she never posted much. People were curious about her, this calm, soft-spoken woman who submitted purple belts and limped off the mat, with her head held higher than the trophy in her hands. But fame, she realized, was not her end goal. She didn't hunger for it, didn't feed off of it like others did. It wasn't fuel, it was fog. And if you weren't careful, it could blur the path that mattered most. So, while others chased the next big tournament, or the next sponsor, or the next viral highlight, Amira did something few expected. She stepped back, not away from jiu-jitsu, never that, but from the noise that had begun to grow louder than the voice inside her. She declined 3 invitational offers, turned down a lucrative rash guard collaboration, muted every notification on her phone, and began her mornings the way she used to before any of this ever began, with silence, tea, and a blank notebook, page waiting to be filled not with pressure, but with presence. She returned to Iron Circle not as a competitor, but as a mentor. It started quietly. At first, she just offered to help the newer white belts during drilling. Those nervous, uncertain souls whose belts looked more like bathrobe ties than martial arts rank. She saw herself in every trembling hand and hesitant grip. Not long ago, that had been her. The woman nobody took seriously, the one mocked for being too gentle to fight. But something shifted when Amira guided them. Her words carried weight, not because she shouted them, but because they came from someone who had walked the same uncertain road and never once pretended it had been easy. She spoke softly, moved patiently, corrected kindly, and the new students gravitated toward her. They trusted her. They believed her. Because Amira didn't just show them technique. She showed them what jiu-jitsu looked like when it was infused with soul. Within a few months, Coach Diego offered her a formal role at the gym, assistant coach for the beginners program. At first, she hesitated. Coaching wasn't something she had aspired to. She still saw herself as a student. But then she realized that coaching was studying. It just required a new level of understanding, not just of the art, but of people. She accepted. And something beautiful began to unfold. Amira learned to teach not with power, but with presence. She didn't bark orders. She invited growth. Her classes were quiet, but focused. Her students, diverse. Teenagers trying to stay out of trouble. Women reclaiming their sense of safety. Older men trying to recapture a sense of vitality. And among them all, Amira moved like a steady flame, never overwhelming, but always guiding. Word spread. Not of her tournament wins, but of her classes, of how she made people feel seen, of how she taught not just how to win, but how to endure, how to lose gracefully, how to return after being broken. Her students began calling her coach, not with fanfare, but with sincerity. And in those moments, those quiet, everyday victories, Amira began to understand something that all her medals could never teach her. Legacy isn't what you win, it's what you leave behind. The lesson became even clearer when she met Naya, a 15-year-old girl whose mother brought her in one rainy afternoon, desperate for something, anything to help her daughter regain confidence after a traumatic bullying incident at school. Naya barely spoke. She flinched at contact. She avoided eye contact and wore long sleeves in the summer. Amira didn't try to force progress. She just gave her space. Quiet encouragement, gentle instruction. And over time, Naya bloomed. Not explosively, but steadily. First came the grip, then the guard, then the takedown. One day after class, Naya lingered behind while everyone else had gone. She approached Amira with tears in her eyes and whispered, "You make me feel like I'm not broken." Amira didn't respond with a speech. She simply knelt beside her, placed a hand over Naya's and said, "You were never broken. You were just becoming." That night, Amira sat on her apartment balcony. The Texas sky sprawled endlessly above her, stars like scattered chalk across a velvet board. She opened her notebook, now almost completely full. Pages of drills, poetry, thoughts, fears, victories, doubts, and diagrams. She flipped to a blank page and, without planning it, began to write. "I was never trying to be feared. I only ever wanted to be free. And now, in teaching others to find their strength, I have found mine. Not in victory, but in presence. Not in power, but in peace." Months passed and seasons turned. Iron Circle grew. Naya earned her second stripe. New white belts came in every week, and Amira remained constant, firm, calm, welcoming. Her students began competing slowly, carefully, with intention. Some won, some didn't. But all of them returned to the mat with the same resolve she had taught them, that jiu-jitsu was never about beating others. It was about becoming more whole within yourself. Then one evening, long after the gym had closed and the mats had cooled, Coach Diego approached her with a small square box. "No speech," he said simply, and handed it to her. Inside was a purple belt, deep, regal, and serene. Amira stared at it for a long time before lifting it gently from the box like a sacred relic. She hadn't expected it, hadn't chased it. But now, holding it in her hands, she realized it didn't represent a new beginning or an end. It represented a circle completed. The quiet girl who once cried in her car after being laughed at for her clumsy shrimping drill had now become a beacon for others. Not because she conquered, but because she endured. Because she walked through the storm with grace. Because she reminded everyone who came after her that you didn't have to be loud to be powerful. You just had to be true. As she tied the purple belt around her waist that night, the knot felt no different than the white one had years ago. And yet, it carried everything. And so, Amira Vargas, the quiet librarian, the unexpected warrior, the storm in soft-spoken form, continued. Not as a champion, though she had won many things. Not as a legend, though stories of her floated like whispers in gyms across the state, but as a guide, as a presence, as proof that the most powerful transformations don't happen in the spotlight. They happen in silence, and they endure forever.